Stede Bonnet. Stede Bonnet, 1688, 10 December 1718, was an early 18th century English Barbadian pirate, also known as the Gentleman Pirate, for the reason that he was a moderately wealthy landowner before turning to a life of crime. Bonnet was born into a wealthy English family on the island of Barbados and inherited the family estate after his father's death in 1694. Despite his lack of sailing experience, Bonnet decided he should turn to piracy in the winter of 1716 or spring of 1717. He bought a sailing vessel, the Revenge, and travelled with his paid crew along the eastern seaboard of what is now the United States, capturing other vessels and burning other Barbadian ships. Bonnet set sail for Nassau in the Bahamas, to the haven for pirates known as the Republic of Pirates, but he was seriously wounded en route during an encounter with a Spanish warship. After arriving in Nassau, Bonnet met Edward Teach, better known as the infamous pirate Blackbeard. Incapable of leading his crew, Bonnet temporarily ceded his ship's command to Blackbeard. Before separating in December 1717, Blackbeard and Bonnet plundered and captured merchant ships along the east coast. After Bonnet failed to capture the Protestant Caesar, his crew abandoned him to join Blackbeard aboard the Queen Anne's Revenge. Bonnet stayed on Blackbeard's ship as a guest and did not command a crew again until summer 1718, when he was pardoned by North Carolina Governor Charles Eden and received clearance to undertake privateering against Spanish shipping interests. Bonnet was tempted to resume his piracy, but did not want to lose his pardon, so he adopted the alias captain Thomas and changed his ship's name to Royal James. He had returned to piracy by July 1718. In August 1718, Bonnet anchored Royal James on an estuary of the Cape Fear River to careen and repair the ship. In late August and September, Colonel William Rhett, with the authorization of South Carolina's Governor Robert Johnson, led a naval expedition against pirates on the river. Rhett's and Bonnet's men engaged in combat for hours, but the outnumbered pirates ultimately surrendered. Rhett arrested the pirates and brought them to Charlestown, now Charleston, South Carolina, in early October. Bonnet escaped on 24 October, but was soon recaptured on Sullivan's Island. On 10 November, Bonnet was brought to trial and charged with 2 acts of piracy. Judge Nicholas Trott sentenced him to death. Bonnet wrote to Governor Johnson to ask for clemency, but Johnson endorsed the judge's decision, and Bonnet was hanged in Charlestown on 10 December 1718. Pre-criminal life. Stede Bonnet was born in 1688, as he was christened at Christ Church Parish on 29 July 1688. His parents, Edward and Sarah Bonnet, owned an estate of over 400 acres, 160 hay, southeast of Bridgetown, which was bequeathed to Bonnet upon his father's death in 1694. It is not known where Bonnet received his education, but many who knew him described him as bookish. Judge Nicholas Trott alluded to Bonnet's liberal education when sentencing him. Bonnet married Mary Allenby in Bridgetown on 21 November 1709. They had 3 sons, Allenby, who died by 1715, Edward and Stede Dure, and a daughter, Mary. The 3 surviving children were all younger than 5 when their father abandoned them for piracy. Edward's granddaughter, Anne Thomasine Clark, was the wife of General Robert Haynes, who was Speaker of the Assembly of Barbados for 36 years. In a general history of the pirates, Charles Johnson wrote that Bonnet was driven to piracy by Mary's nagging and unguided discomforts he found in a married state. Details of Bonnet's military service are unclear, but he held the rank of major in the Barbados militia. The rank was probably due to his land holdings, since deterring slave rebellions was an important function of the militia. Bonnet's militia service coincided with the War of the Spanish Succession, but there is no record that he took part in the fighting. Escape, recapture, and execution. In Charlestown, Bonnet was separated from the bulk of his crew and held for 3 weeks, along with his boatswain, Ignatius Pell, and his sailing master, David Heriot, at the home of Town Marshal Nathaniel Partridge. Tyrant Edward Robinson, the gunner from Newcastle upon Tyne, and the remaining crew were held outside of Charlestown at the Watch House at White Point. On 24 October, Bonnet and Heriot escaped, probably by colluding with local merchant Richard Tuckerman. Governor Johnson at once placed a I-700 bounty on Bonnet's head and dispatched search teams to track him down. Bonnet and Heriot, accompanied by a slave and a Native American, obtained a boat and made for the north shore of Charlestown Harbor, but foul winds and lack of supplies forced the four of them onto Sullivan's Island. Governor Johnson sent a posse under Rhett to Sullivan's Island to hunt for Bonnet. The posse discovered Bonnet after an extensive search and opened fire, killing Heriot and wounding the two slaves. Bonnet surrendered and was returned to Charlestown. While awaiting trial, some sort of civil uprising in his support took place within the city, an event authorities would later describe as having nearly resulted in the burning of the town and the overthrow of the government. Bonnet possibly awaited his execution in the Court of Guard, a militia guardhouse in the city where the current exchange and provost stands today. On 10 November 1718, Bonnet was brought to trial before Sir Nicholas Trott, sitting in his capacity as Vice Admiralty Judge. Bonnet was formally charged with only 2 acts of piracy against the Francis and the Fortune, whose commanders were on hand to testify against Bonnet in person. Ignatius Pell had turned King's evidence in the trial of Bonnet's crew and testified, somewhat reluctantly, against Bonnet. Bonnet pleaded not guilty and conducted his own defense without assistance of counsel, cross-examining the witnesses to little avail and calling a character witness in his favor. Trott rendered a damning summation of the evidence, and the jury delivered a guilty verdict. 2 days later, after treating the convicted man to a stern lecture on his violation of Christian duties, Trott sentenced Bonnet to death. While awaiting his execution, Bonnet wrote to Governor Johnson, begging abjectly for clemency and promising to have his own arms and legs cut off as assurance that he would never again commit piracy. Charles Johnson wrote that Bonnet's visibly disintegrating mind moved many Carolinians to pity, particularly the female population, and London papers later reported that the governor delayed his execution 7 times. Bonnet was eventually hanged at White Point Garden in Charlestown on 10 December 1718.